are not going to be able to catch him, and the ball game is over. Hield lays it in. It's 157 to 152, and Indiana has clinched this group.
Scoring in the NBA this season is at an all-time high. That's something you've probably heard plenty in recent years, so much so that you might actually be tired of hearing it. However, it's talked about a lot for a reason, because every single year, offenses are getting better and better, and consequently, teams are scoring more and more points. If we take a look at every NBA offense since the three-point line was introduced, of the top 10 scoring teams, 5 of them are from this season, plus 1 from last season. And if we measure all-time efficiency and remove pace from the equation, 9 of the top 10 offenses the NBA has ever seen are from 2024. And if we zoom out even further, we need to go all the way back to the 38th best offense of all time to find a team that isn't from the past few years. You can be ranked 7th in offense this season and still have a better offense than literally any other NBA team that came before you. While we've been told offense is what sells tickets, lately the NBA has seen a decline in viewership, all while complaints about the game becoming too one-sided are at an all-time high. So in today's video, I want to answer a few questions. How did we get here? Why are offenses the way that they are now? Has offense gone too far? And if so, what can be done about it? Before I get into today's video, I want to talk about our sponsor, Factor. If you're like me, aka a 20-something who has no idea what they're doing with your life, well, odds are you probably have a pretty erratic meal plan. Generally speaking, for me, eating healthy and especially eating consistently can be quite difficult. Luckily, today's sponsor is a huge help in both of these areas. Factor makes your nutrition goals easy by delivering fresh, never frozen meals right to your door. I know the health benefits are what might stand out to you initially, but eating on a consistent schedule is also a huge help for your body. And if you have a hectic schedule, being able to prepare something quickly like you can with Factor really helps. Only 2 minutes in the microwave and your meal is ready. Another thing that's great with Factor is it's pretty customizable. You can specify options to your dietary restrictions. There are vegan options, calorie smart options if you're trying to lose weight, keto options if you're avoiding carbs, and protein plus if you're trying to get them gains. Factor also offers gourmet meals as a part of your weekly options, which means you can get a little bit of gourmet with your meal plan whenever you are craving something special. Over the last few months, I've finally been able to get on top of my meal plan. I struggled with this for years, but now because of Factor, when I don't have the time to prepare something, I can get the speed paired with the nutrition as well as a great taste. Head to Factor75 or use the link in the description and use code RustyBuckets50 to get 50% off of your first Factor box. Again, that is code RustyBuckets50 for 50% off of your first box. Thank you to Factor for sponsoring this video. See, offense in the NBA has experienced a handful of peaks and valleys throughout its history. And if you zoom out a bit past the 90s, you'll see that the slower, grinded-out era of the NBA is really more of the anomaly. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's do a quick rundown of the NBA's history of offense. In the beginning, naturally, the game was in its more primitive era. Positions and their job descriptions were extremely rigid. There wasn't very much flash, and the game was played very fundamentally, but there was a pretty high pace of play. This resulted in players putting up insane individual numbers, such as Wilt's 50-point-per-game season, and multiple bigs averaging 20-plus rebounds for whole seasons, and it was these Goliaths on the court who conquered the paint and the NBA at large. Basketball was undeniably a big man's game. Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain were the premier figures of the 60s, facing off in the playoffs 8 out of the 10 years of the decade, but there was also smaller players who operated from the perimeter, like Oscar Robertson, Jerry West, Elgin Baylor, Going into the 70s, John Havlicek and Rick Barry. Being a big wasn't the only way to impact the game, but it was believed to be the most likely to result in winning. This was especially hard to dispute considering the undeniable dynasty that was the Bill Russell Celtics, who won 9 championships in the 60s. You'll notice I'm using star players' names to frame the conversation here, but that's because that's just kind of how it is in the NBA. In general, NBA offenses have evolved around the dominance of individuals. So in the era of big men, offensive plays would usually start in the post, while guards and wings would attempt to get open for jumpers and backdoor cuts, doing so off of this post action while avoiding dribbling the ball entirely. Shots closer to the basket typically go in at a higher rate, so scoring through your tallest player as close to the basket as possible was an intuitive approach. Having a generational defensive player like Bill Russell was one of the only ways to slow down the offense because generally, shots would go up quick. 115 points per game was the average amount scored by teams in the 60s. This was primarily due to the pace as teams shot in the low 40s from the field. This is the pace of the 60s, and then here's the rest of it. They were running. This wasn't efficient offense, but it was high enough volume to result in super high scoring numbers. The game would not radically change in the 70s, but its face did. As Bill and Wilt exited their primes as players, the next center to become an icon in the NBA was drafted #1 overall in 1969 as Ferdinand Louis Alcindor Jr., and he would retire known as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the greatest of all time. Kareem's 70s were much like the 60s, except with less chaotic offense and more deliberate pace. The speed of the game dialed down while the efficiency on offense turned up. This was the opposite style of basketball of the new competitor league, the ABA, which featured more free-flowing offense, star talent, and entertainment value before it merged with the NBA in 1976. By 1979, scoring was down to 110 points per game, but team field goal percentage was much improved. 79 was also the year that Magic Johnson and Larry Bird broke onto the scene, two kind of big players at 6'9", who also had the skills to be elite ball handlers, passers, and shot creators. Their presence in the NBA through the 80s defined the decade, along with other wings like Michael Jordan, Alex English, Adrian Dantley, James Worthy, and Dr. J. Big men still had their place in the league, but building around them was not perceived as the only way to win anymore. The 80s had a historic 7 MVPs who were not big men, and only one, arguably 2 championship teams led by a center. This refreshing upward trend from wing players, along with some rule changes, resulted in an offensive boom in the NBA. The first of these rule changes was in 1979, the beginning of the end of hand checking, which is when the defender puts their hand or arm on the offensive player while defending them. It'd take more than 20 years for the NBA to basically eliminate it from the game, but the way defensive contact was allowed became more specified here. Dribbling had also become less strictly officiated through the 70s and 80s, and zone defense was also outlawed in 1982. But the most consequential rule change in basketball history was in 1980, when three-pointers, originally part of the ABA, were finally brought to the NBA. However, through the 80s, threes were taken so infrequently that they were considered more of a novelty than a weapon. And yet, teams were scoring 109 points per game on average for the decade, which is even more than the 2010s, all while being even more efficient than any era that came. That's right, the 80s were not as defensively oriented as you may have been led to believe. The 80s were, more or less, the birthplace of the offense-first approach that we see in its most mature state today. Defense still had its place, but the game became defined by buckets. Obviously, teams were scoring even more in the 60s, but doing so in an almost artificial way given how much the pace inflated everything. 80s offenses were far more versatile in their approach and efficient, all while maintaining high scoring averages. And this was not perceived as a problem like it is today. If anything, this is what the NBA and its fans wanted. The ABA had created very real competition for the NBA in the 70s with its offensive-focused style of play that resembled playground hoops at the highest level. And by the end of the post-merger 80s, the NBA had learned the lesson that offenses with more dynamic play styles made for better basketball, and had fully implemented its plan to shape the game to be this way. But this offensive explosion came to an end as scoring came to a grinding halt in the 90s. So how did scoring disappear? Well, it took a team coming out of nowhere with a style that was like neither the flash of Magic Showtime Lakers nor the fundamental offense of Birds Celtics. One where offense wasn't even its identity. Instead, it was defense first. That team was the Bad Boy Pistons.
Michael Jordan with Pippen.
I ain't no joke. I used to let the mic smoke. Now I slam it when I'm done and make sure it's broke. When I'm done, I won't get sold, cause I won't let nobody press up and mess up the scene I set. I like to stand in the crowd and watch people wonder, damn. But think about it, then you understand. I'm just an addict, addicted to music. Maybe it's a habit. I gotta use it, even if it's jazz or the quiet storm. I hope the beat up converted into hip hop.
All the way up. Go! There's the shot. And the game's over, and the Pistons have won the World Championship. Back to back.
The Detroit Pistons are in many ways the antithesis of modern basketball and were a direct response to what had been the winning style of the 80s. On defense, they embodied what it meant to be intimidating. They were called the Bad Boys for a reason. Bill Laimbeer was a fucking violent oaf of a center. Dennis Rodman won DPOY in 1990 and is one of the most talented defenders and rebounders of all time despite being 6'7". Joe Dumars is one of the more underrated two-way players in NBA history, and on offense this team was led by Isaiah Thomas, one of the greatest point guards of all time. But in terms of play style, while they had more offensive grace than many gave them credit for, especially in the revised version of history, they were ultimately most known for their, well, violence. They also made their opponents play at their pace, which was much slower than your average offense was used to. They zigged when the rest of basketball zagged, and it got them back-to-back titles. They managed to be a top 3 defense both times when they won it all while being just 7th and 11th on offense. They embodied the phrase defense wins championships, or I guess aggravated assault depending on what state you're in. This playstyle ended up being extremely influential, more so than I think the NBA would have liked. See, through the 80s, the image of the NBA was in the process of being molded from a low-level sports league with rampant drug problems, violent incidents on the court, and an overall bad reputation, to a family-friendly entertainment product built on the personalities of its superstars and electrifying offensive highlights. And the Bad Boys were fucking that up. Detroit sparked the beginning of the defense-first era in the NBA. Since the shot clock was invented, scoring has never gotten lower than it did in the 90s and 2000s, and it almost certainly will not get that low again. The physicality that had been present before was now fundamental to the sport. But nobody wants to play running back in basketball. Driving to the lane too often meant dealing with serious physical punishment from defenders. So teams slowed down their offensive approach, pounding the rock and waiting for an open opportunity rather than facing pain as much as possible, scoring just 101 points per game on average in the 90s, and that got even lower at just 96.9 points per game in the 2000s, the only decade where teams scored less than 100 points per game in the shot clock era. However, the NBA wasn't going to let the game turn back into something resembling previous decades that had less success than the very popular 80s, especially as it transitioned into making a young guard named Michael, who just three-peated scoring titles, the next face of basketball. So, rules were added and altered throughout the entirety of the defensive era to try and swing the pendulum back in favor of high-octane offense. This would have an undeniable domino effect for how offense is played today. Since the three-point line was an already available and underutilized part of the game, the NBA encouraged more long-range shooting by shortening the three-point line from 23 feet 9 inches at its longest to a uniform 22 feet in 1994, before bringing it back to the original distance 3 seasons later. During that time, three-point shot attempts nearly doubled in frequency. And it didn't hurt that fewer drives to the basket meant less chances for contact between players, and thus less chances for brawls to break out, something that had happened pretty often as a result of the physicality of the game increasing over time. The 90s also saw the beginning of players and teams suffering serious penalties for fighting during games, as even leaving the bench could get a player and the team fined, and players getting too rough on the court would get ejected. All defensive fouls were no longer created equally. 2002 saw the total return of zone defense after some years of phasing it back into the game, as well as the inception of the 3-second violation, making it much harder to clog the lane on defense. And 2005 completely banned hand-checking after trying and failing to rein it in since 1979. This made attacking from the perimeter much easier, so scoring guards became a lot more prominent, and big-bodying people down low became a lot more challenging. There was also a big change in terms of what fouls you could get away with. In general, any level of contact became increasingly likely to be called a foul, so defenses eased up. This style of officiating was cemented in part thanks to the Malice in the Palace, one of the ugliest events in NBA history, where two of the toughest and most defensive-minded teams in the league ended up in a massive brawl that involved players, coaches, and even fans, all nationally televised on ESPN. Through the NBA's defense-first era, players were getting hit harder and harder than ever before, especially for a sport originally designed based around avoiding contact. Naturally, players would take exception to some of these hard fouls, and it would cause altercations. This is something that many NBA fans are now nostalgic for, but once the Malice in the Palace happened, the NBA wanted to completely eliminate these conflicts, as it was not a good look for the league. And since these altercations started with hard fouls, that meant that hard fouls needed harder consequences. These rule changes also shifted the power balance in the league in regard to its top players. Now, guys who couldn't dominate due to the physicality around them suddenly had the freedom to get to whatever spot on the floor they wanted without fear of being clotheslined. And as the NBA transitioned from the defensive era into the LeBron and Kobe puppet commercial era, scoring climbed higher and higher. In the early 2010s, we got offensive experimentation from the likes of the beautiful game Spurs and the Miami Heatles, and then came the three-point revolution.
Decide not to use it. Curry, way downtown. Bang! Bang! Oh, what a shot from Curry!
For NBA history, 14 threes in a game.
Lillard, long-range three. And it's good!
There's 2 seconds. There's the knockdown.
I got it!
3 seconds. Stay posed.
Stephen Curry and the Warriors exploded onto the scene in such a way that the shock waves of their success changed the game in a way that is entirely in a league of its own. There's not a single culture shift, play style, rule change, or whatever else that's impact can compare to that of the three-pointer. From this moment on, the game, and more specifically offense, would never be the same. The rule changes through the 90s and 2000s shaped the game to be more perimeter-oriented, which enabled this revolution. But that being said, the spike in three-pointers was not something that the NBA exactly anticipated. It just happened. The most threes any team would take in a game rarely exceeded 20 prior to the paradigm shift in shot selection, far from what it is today, where teams are taking 35 a game on average, with some teams getting to the 40s. Prior to 2013, the NBA only had 24 instances in its entire history where a team took 40 or more three-point shots in a game. Now, it's the norm. Because of the value of three-point shooting, not only are long mid-range jumpers being replaced by threes in the NBA's shot diet, and that results in more points on its own, but also, and more importantly than that, it's the space it gives offenses to operate with. The likelihood of running into multiple defenders at the rim today is far less than in any other era of NBA history. Teams can't crowd the paint quite like they used to due to the threat of the outside shot, so scoring in the paint becomes easier as well. Hell, even mid-range shots become easier and more likely to go in because defense is so difficult to play in the modern NBA that defenders have to regularly concede open shots, and they're most likely to concede a midi as it's the least efficient shot in the game now. The three-point revolution ironically made scoring from everywhere on the floor significantly easier. At all three levels, there are more shots available than ever, and with more opportunity to score than ever. And with more opportunity to score than ever, it's been an arms race with every single NBA team to see how they can take advantage. The outcome of the three-point revolution is the state of the game we find ourselves in today, the post-three-point era, where almost every team in the NBA statistically has one of the best offenses of all time. Even the best defenses in the league regularly have to accept allowing open shots now, and as a result, offense has become far more important than defense. Obviously, the game has always been about who can score the most points, but now it more or less feels like, okay, you watch me score and then I'll watch you score. And that's just not the most satisfying viewing experience for a lot of people. But that's not to say that players aren't trying on D. They're just damned if they do pretty often because of how much the game has opened up for the offense in the last 20-ish years or so. You can play perfect defense and the shots still go in. And actually, that's something I want to go ahead and clear up here. If you have ever said the phrase, players don't try on defense anymore, please shut the hell up forever. Full stop, you are just incorrect. Don't get me wrong, there's for sure a higher volume of guys who just don't play defense than there once was. However, the reason there is less of a defensive presence in this sport is entirely unrelated to whether or not players want to play defense. The amount of fucking mouth-breathing, knuckle-dragging doofuses I see directly compare 90s defenses to today's is astounding, as if those are even remotely similar contexts. Not only can defenders not be nearly as physical as they used to, but more importantly than that, they also have to cover so much more space. Teams are running just as much, if not more, than they ever have, and they're shooting from further while they're at it. It's much easier to cover this amount of ground as a defender than it is to cover this amount of ground. This is why versatility is preached like the gospel in the modern NBA. Decisions on defense need to be made quickly, and defenders need to have the length and foot speed to cover lots of ground to avoid giving up open looks. Defenders have been getting shafted by the changes to this sport as the years go on, so I'm fucking tired of hearing people talk about it like it's an effort thing. Like, this generation of players is just soft. Do you realize how simple-minded that perspective is? If not, well, hopefully you do now. Anyways, rant aside, the point that I am trying to arrive at is that we need justice for these defensive players, not to scold them for things that are outside of their control. The pendulum has swung so far on the side of offense that the game has lost a lot of the balance that it had previously. At least, that's how I feel, and a lot of other people do too. The only question is, What are rules and why do they exist? Why are rules made for sports the way that they are, and how have these rules developed? Well, and please stick with me here, rules are technology. To quote a philosophy podcast, the essence of technology is revealing the things in the world that already do exist and can potentially exist in the future. Technology is the art of bringing forth the potentiality of the wooden rolling pin latent within a tree, or bringing forth the potentiality of the marble statue latent within the giant piece of rock. Originally, basketball was meant to be a safe, low-contact sport, seeming to intrinsically have a favoritism towards offense because of it. Get a bucket is the goal on offense. Don't fuck with him too hard or he gets a free shot is the goal on defense. The existence of the concept of a foul resulting in a trip to the free throw line is inherently much more of a punishment for the defense than it is for the offense. But that was just the beginning, when some Canadian teacher was trying to get his students to stop being so rowdy, accidentally inventing a major sport in the process. Fast forwarding beyond the inception of basketball to today, in our current cultural context, rules attempt to shape the game by revealing the most profitable version of it. The NBA is a collection of capitalist pigs all in cahoots to make sure that they get even richer. The profit motive shapes the rules of the game because there is almost no intermediary between those who make the rules and those who own the league. The rules established at the NBA's inception were more or less completely in the hands of the original team owners. But as the league has grown, so too has the level of empowerment its players have, mostly through their unionization and the allure of the celebrity status that the league's top players gained alongside the NBA's popularity as a whole. But it has never compared to the power the league has itself. And for the owners, making basketball as profitable as possible means it must be safe for mass appeal among the consuming class, and the most appealing product to this demographic is entertainment. The US media and entertainment industry accounts for 6.9% of the total US GDP, over $700 billion. So if you can entertain people, you've got your golden goose. In our last video, we touched a bit on escapism as a reason that people seek out sports, but this more generally applies to entertainment as well. People often seek relief from the monotony of day-to-day life with movies, television, video games, YouTube videos, books if you're a nerd, and sports if you're a different kind of nerd. As long as people have had 9-to-5 jobs, which is probably less time than you think, they've been using their downtime to consume entertainment, regardless of their motivation. Even before industrialization, people have been drawn to stadiums filled with tens of thousands of people to watch athletes compete, or get ripped apart by lions, depending on what you're into. But especially since the dawn of industrial society, the commodification of entertainment has changed the existence of the entertainer from a person to a product. The explosion in popularity of artists, athletes, and any other entertainers in between over the 20th century has resulted in a complex form of exploitation that's unprecedented in human history, one that elevates the premier entertainers of the world from relative obscurity to undeniable notoriety. The popularity of our entertainers now versus back then is essentially the difference between a local band and the Beatles. For a lot of the industry, it's providing the opportunity for the consumer to have fun, to experience joy. Many entertainment products cultivate experiences that wouldn't necessarily be defined as fun, but the most profitable entertainment products certainly would be. Look at the film industry. There's ample, excellent, critically acclaimed films that are hard to call fun without some roundabout explanation. But the ones that make the most money are not those films. It's the blockbusters, the movies that, while capable of exploring a wide scope of emotions and different artistic expressions, ultimately wind up being most easily described as fun at the end of the day. All of this was a long-winded build-up to say, when basketball fun, basketball make money. For the sake of maximizing profits, the NBA is going to use the rules to shape the game to be as fun to consume as possible. There's multiple examples of this throughout the history of the sport, some of which we discussed earlier, but one of the most recent and significant examples of the NBA being in the business of fun management is James Harden. The Beard is a historically polarizing player. While he's put up historic numbers, a distinct part of the way he actually got those numbers is a notably not fun method of offense known as foul baiting. Foul baiting is an offensive approach that emphasizes initiating contact to get free opportunities at the line, rather than from the live action on the floor. It's essentially the offensive equivalent of flopping on defense. While the concept of foul baiting existed before Harden, he exploited it to a degree that made it impossible to ignore. Free throws are one of the least entertaining parts of this sport, as it slows down the pace of play down to a halt, literally stopping the clock. Plus, the way Harden drew these fouls was visually unappealing to say the least, which is noteworthy because aesthetics actually play a huge part in fan enjoyment of the sport. However, that's a conversation for another video. Regardless, foul baiting is almost universally disliked, so the NBA has tried and failed to legislate these tactics away. It's not something the NBA has addressed well, but the attempt itself is indicative of the NBA's goal of cultivating the sport to be what it wants it to be, which is first and foremost, entertaining. Now the question is that the right thing to do? Ethically speaking, should the game be cultivated towards being the best entertainment product it can possibly be? Or is there a purity in letting the game evolve however it does with minimal interference? Is there even a morality of governing sports? Like, the three-point revolution is something that happened mostly separate from the rules. The incentive to shoot from three has existed as long as the three-point line was there, but teams didn't really go for it until the NBA directly incentivized it when they briefly shortened the three-point line, and even then, teams still weren't about it nearly to the degree that they are now. The guiding hand of the NBA's rulebook and those who write it no doubt have some responsibility for the state of the game today, but the three-point revolution was led by the game itself and not its governors. Yet it also would have been impossible without decades of tinkering and management from them either. It's complicated. But why has foul baiting prevailed despite the NBA's attempt to shape it out of the game? The answer is the staying power of analytics, something that very much supported the Harden foul baiting style. The trouble is the unique obviousness of these analytics that show that it's much more valuable to go for more free throws and shoot more three-pointers. Free throws are just, plain and simple, the best quality shot on offense you can get. There is literally no defense, plus the players get a breather while the clock is stopped. And three-pointers are obviously worth one more point than the usual two, so even if you are making your two-point shots 50% of the time, getting 1 point per possession, you can miss twice as often from three and still get the same results on an average basis. Making half of your twos is the equivalent of making 1 out of every 3 three-pointers. Plus, there's the benefit of creating space for your teammates inside when the defense has to guard you outside. This is a kind of Pandora's box where the most efficient way to play the game has been revealed, and that can't be undone. But efficient basketball doesn't necessarily mean fun basketball, i.e. James Harden's foul baiting, but efficiency does equal winning basketball. So fun and winning can be at odds. There's no way the NBA can legislate away the motivation to win from competition, nor would they really want to. There is a balance to be struck here, one that is difficult, but worthwhile for the good of the sport and the success of the NBA as a business. The rolling pin exists inside the tree. The marble statue exists within the stone. The perfect balance of rules and play styles exists inside the NBA as an organization, but it's up to us to shape it to be that rolling pin or that statue. Something important to acknowledge here is that all of this is subjective. Fun is subjective. There's a lot of fans who find things in this sport to be fun that I'm not thrilled about, and vice versa. One of my favorite players of all time, like literally ranked number 3 for me, is Andrei Kirilenko. because I love defensive versatility, and his super high block and steal numbers are just very exciting. Nothing like a shot-blocking wingman, let me tell you. Some of you might think I'm crazy for that, and your top 10 faves list doesn't feature a single player scoring less than 25 points a game. Point being, what you perceive to be fun basketball isn't necessarily fun basketball for someone else. Maybe the most fun version of the NBA is just the purest version, let the rules be the rules and leave it untouched forever. But regardless of how you feel about it, the NBA is going to make changes, and personally, I think that's exactly what they should do. I understand a more purist perspective on the game, just look at baseball fans, but to me, I think we're being dishonest if we're going to act like the game is something that exists separately from entertainment. This is an entertainment product, and if there's a dip in the entertainment value of the sport, well, then that's something that's worth addressing, just like the NBA attempted to do with foul baiting. So does the abundant offense of this new era of the NBA demand an intervention? Has NBA offense gone too far? One of my favorite teams in the league this year is the Indiana Pacers, or at least they were one of my favorite teams in the league. Towards the start of the season, their play style was exciting and mesmerizing to me, but as the games kept piling up, slowly but surely my smile turned into a frown as I felt the boomer NBA fan in me start to boil up. The breaking point for me was when the Pacers played the Hawks, where I watched 4 quarters straight of bucket after bucket. By the time it was over, they had scored a combined 309 points. They were scoring 76 points a quarter combined on average. I watched this game and began to feel a pain in my chest. What happened to the game I love? Okay, in all seriousness, what is it that bothers me so much about the Pacers? How did they go from my go-to League Pass team to a team that often makes me genuinely upset? Well, as someone that likes defense, that's obviously missing, but somehow, even worse than that, is the offense. Yeah, I realize that might sound weird. How is the offense worse? Surely more offense equals better offense, right? Yeah, no. Hard no. Higher scoring offenses do not necessarily equal a better viewing experience of offense. To put it simply, if there's not a tangible defensive presence, then the offense doesn't feel earned, and thus doesn't feel entertaining to the degree that it would otherwise. Watching the Pacers is like watching an all-star game. If you were to describe the All-Star Game to someone who's not a major NBA fan, they'd likely think that All-Star Weekend is a pretty major event that fans really care about every year. But it's not, is it? All the superstar players, all the fancy presentation, the celebrities and the allure, and the All-Star Game still really doesn't mean shit to anyone. And that's largely because the All-Star Game itself is boring because they don't play defense. You can shoot it from as far as you want, throw fancy and super ambitious lobs, do windmills on the fast break, pull all the stops to make offense as fun and flashy as possible, and it still doesn't hit. All because you'd see more defense if you tuned into a YMCA pickup game instead. Offense is devalued by bad defense. Watching teams score 130 to 150 points, all the buckets begin to blur together. And if you've watched one possession, it seems like you've watched them all. Not only because of poor defense, but also the general uniformity of modern offenses. Calling back to analytics and the arms race following the three-point revolution, a side effect of that wave is that offenses have become less and less unique. As the best ways to score get demonstrated over time, why would players and coaches choose to score in any other way but what works best? The exploits on offense are now universally known around the league, and every team is going to try and use them. If you look at the top teams in the NBA, they're pretty much always going to be a team with a lead shot creator and playmaker, being the same player in this case, likely a large wing, surrounded by play finishers, in particular three-point shooters, and they're going to drive and kick over and over until they've created an advantage. Being a fast-paced team also isn't as impactful as it used to be. When everybody's trying to be fast, it makes being a fast team less of an advantage, and more importantly, it makes it less unique. Just for an example of that, this season, the slowest paced team in the entire NBA is the Chicago Bulls with a pace of 96.1. The 7 seconds or less Phoenix Suns in 2005, a year where they won 62 games and had the best offense in the NBA, had a pace of 95.9. The Steve Nash Suns, known specifically for their pace, would be the slowest team in the league this year. So every team is fast, every team is shooting a ton of threes, every team is built around a creating superstar or just a star if they're unlucky. There's a lot to be said about the enjoyment of variety. In many ways, the variety we like in our lives can be artificial, especially in regards to the products we consume. Most competitors in any given industry are actually owned by the same larger parent company. But the variance in NBA team identity prior to the three-point revolution was far from artificial. Many different teams had many different play styles with many different approaches and core principles. Now, the more and more you watch, the more things start to blend together into the same play style across the entire league. Not just the Pacers, but the whole NBA. This is likely a part of the reason why the spectrum of teams' win-loss records each season has become more narrow. It used to be a lot less common to have 60-win seasons, and there used to be a huge difference between a 1 and an 8 seed. But because the way teams play has been homogenized, the differences between good teams are smaller than ever. You could argue this is a good thing for the sake of parity, and this is certainly the highest level of parity the NBA has ever seen, but do we want parity if it means sacrificing variety? Is 30 identical teams who all have an equal chance at the title a good thing? Obviously, it's not been taken to that extreme, but it's definitely going in that direction. This homogeneity of hoops dilutes the level of competition down to where it lacks any of its flavor. Fucking ridiculous line. Of hoops dilutes. This sounds like a fucking Dr. Seuss book. The essence of basketball is lost when defense is almost impossible to play unless you're elite. If the average NBA player doesn't make much of an impact on defense, that's a problem at the core of basketball. An essential quality to this sport is the head-to-head element. One of the somewhat unique aspects of this sport is the degree in which every player is expected to play both ways. Sure, other sports have players expected to play offense and defense, but the expectations of a point guard versus a pitcher or Michael Jordan versus Messi is that the basketball players don't have the option to not play both sides of the ball. There's no designated hitter equivalent in the NBA. In our Death of Positions video, we briefly discussed how different positions have different levels of responsibility on defense and offense, but even the least defensive-oriented position in basketball still has immeasurably more defense to play than, say, a striker on the soccer field whose main job is to score goals. So when basketball is devolved into just taking turns on offense, the game arguably becomes something else. Other versions of basketball without the two-way element are called something different, like horse and the three-point contest or skills challenge. So this new era of NBA basketball, where defense is increasingly rare and matters less than ever, might just become a new sport entirely. And even if you're a hater of defense and a lover of the modern game, I challenge you to ask yourself this. Do fun, entertainment, and profits trump the importance of retaining the essence of the game that's always been played? Is it worth it to make basketball stop being a two-way sport and make it three-point golf instead? And if your answer to this is the same as mine, then the question becomes, the balance between offense and defense is a difficult one to strike. The three-point revolution spawning from the rule changes of the defensive era was absolutely unforeseen by the NBA. There are unintended consequences all the time. Changes are difficult to actually implement, and there's a unique challenge here that is unprecedented in NBA history. While the NBA can attempt to legislate one side of the analytics equation that is discernibly bad for business, as they've tried to with foul baiting rules, not even the NBA itself could close Pandora's box. The three-point revolution and the analytics that followed it happened, and there's no turning back. You aren't fully reversing this. There is no changing the math of the game. Not that the NBA necessarily would want to take back all of the things that have come with analytics. The three-point shooting part of it was profitable, at least in the beginning. The Warriors going from Monte Ellis to Stephen Curry brought them from a low-tier value team to one of the most valuable franchises in the NBA, which supports the idea that offense is ultimately what's profitable. Spacing and shooting equals offense, which equals money, right? Well, yes, but only up to a certain point. And we're seeing the game tip over into the territory where the offensive gains are not yielding higher viewership. In fact, it actually seems to turn people off. The impact of this shift in the game has begun to wash out the other side of the floor, and that has consequences in the viewership department. Three-point shooting isn't going anywhere. The understanding of shot values isn't going anywhere. So legislating ourselves into a new game isn't going to be easy. We can't just go back to what it was, and I don't think sticking with the direction it's going is the move either. So we need to establish some goals for how we're going to reshape the game into something more balanced. The first goal we'll discuss here is to incentivize schematic creativity, bringing back the flavor of having teams using their own play styles and disrupting the homogeny of the current game could do a lot to spark another level of intrigue from fans. Harkening back to the illusion of choice, the reason that it's something that we all buy into is the sense of identity that can come from it. Even if it's mere mundane decisions as consumers, like Xbox versus PlayStation, things like that. And rooting for a team that has a certain style of play you can identify with is just another form of that consumption. And yet, in 2024, in the post-3-point era, the sameness of play styles has weakened this aspect of the NBA's product. So, variety is a key pillar to establish here. Defense is another one. If you haven't figured it out by now, we want there to be more of a defensive influence than there currently is. More defense forces more variety from offenses. Modern offenses have become simpler due to a lack of defense in the league, so if we want to increase variety, we must turn up the dial on D. So, those are our goals. Now it's time to figure out how we get there. We've already established that rules are technology for optimizing the game, so rule changes are probably our best bet for continuing to do that. There's been a lot of discussions about this topic recently, so I wanted to get a good grasp of the general conversation. I decided to tweet asking you guys what you think could be done to change the state of the game. Maybe the most popular idea in this field is the idea of removing the defensive three in the key violation. Defenders are not allowed to stand in the paint for more than 3 seconds on defense unless they're defending an offensive opponent who is also in the paint. The idea of removing defensive three in the key is that it would give defenders more freedom in terms of how they cover the floor, and thus there would be more of a defensive influence. Bringing back hand checking and allowing more physicality was popular. Removing foul baiting actually, instead of the league just playing lip service to it, was a common idea. I've seen suggestions like moving the three-point line further back, which I can't say I'm a fan of, but points for creativity, I guess. Reducing the 8-second violation into a 6-second violation was suggested. However, with the pace of the modern game, I'm not sure it would really matter much. Could potentially be used strategically by defenses, but I have my doubts it would make much of an impact. Reversing the offensive rebounding clock change that happened a couple of years ago could definitely slow the pace at least marginally, though again, I doubt it would have major effects. A few suggested adding FIBA's rule around the rim and goaltending and all that. I'm personally not a fan of that idea, though. I know the FIBA's rules are popular, but I personally think the NBA has this one right already. But with some general ideas out there, I wanted to end the video with some of my own propositions. Here's what I suggest the league do. You know, what I would do if I were the commissioner, let's say. Before I go on, I do want to say that, like, none of these are 500 IQ suggestions. They're all pretty simple. There's probably some rules that far smarter basketball minds than me could figure out that are more complex than these. But I'm confident that all 5 of these rules would dramatically increase the influence of defense on the modern game, all while not going too far in the opposite direction. You don't want to overcorrect. So, with that said, proposal number 1, 6 in the key. Many have suggested that the NBA remove the 3 in the key rule as a way to encourage more defense being played. However, I think fully removing it goes to too high of an extreme. The argument is often that the game is more about threes anyway, so allowing extra defense in the paint will overall just mean more defense and lower scoring outputs. And from the perspective of a modern defender, I somewhat understand this. Let's say you're a big man in 2024. These days, defensively, you have to be moving around the perimeter and away from the paint far more than ever before. And on top of that, when you're in the paint, now you have to worry about standing there too long. I agree it's a bit much, a rule that made a lot more sense for an era where there wasn't nearly as much movement and versatility expected out of defenders. Just loading up in the paint isn't as effective of a strategy as it would have been in the 90s. However, it still would be quite effective, and that's why I can't outright say 3 in the key needs to be removed. Regardless of how valuable and how emphasized three-point shooting is in the modern NBA, shots in the paint still remain and will always remain the most valuable shot in basketball. The prevalence of three-point shooting not only expands the game to the perimeter, but also makes paint scoring easier. And if you allowed a defender to just stand right under the rim, well, at that point you're going to only get even more three-pointers, or at least ugly-ass drives. I think it ruins the flow of the game if defenses are just never going to leave the paint, and that's exactly what would happen. Believe me, I am certain the Grizzlies, Spurs, Thunder, and Timberwolves would love nothing more than to have Jaren Jackson Jr., Wemby, Chet Holmgren, and Rudy Gobert stand at the basket and just never allow a shot at the rim. But I do agree 3 seconds is a bit limiting, so I'm proposing it be doubled to 6 seconds. Obviously, 3 in the key isn't called the moment 3 seconds has passed, or at least not often, and I expect the same situation would apply here. So rim protectors get more opportunity to load up on the paint, which allows for more of a defensive presence, but not enough that it becomes a cheat code for defenses to never allow shots around the rim. Remember, the goal is to balance offense and defense, not just shift all the power to the other side. Proposal number 2, the no foul baiting, for real this time rule. And yeah, it's really as simple as that. The NBA was on the right track towards adding more of a defensive aspect to the game when they introduced the anti-foul baiting rules to the sport. Not only does foul baiting result in free throws when it happens, but just the very risk of giving up foul bait makes defense harder. Players who are known to foul bait will use the threat of their potential to draw a foul to make their defenders hesitate and not play as strong a defense as they otherwise would. Or they deploy unconventional and just frankly weird and ugly alternative styles of defense. Seriously, the very existence of defense like this is proof in itself of how much defense isn't allowed to be played anymore. I think foul baiting that initiates contact should be a technical foul, resulting in free throws for the defender's team equal to the amount of points the offensive player was attempting to generate. So if you foul bait on a three-pointer, the defender gets to shoot 3 free throws now. Sure, this might be a bit extreme of a punishment, but honestly, that's exactly what I want it to be. My hope with this is that it would be such an extreme punishment that it eradicates foul baiting from the game entirely. It would hopefully be a call that is very seldom made. And I'm not worried about any potential ambiguity either, because players know when they're foul baiting. It's not like an unconscious thing. Sure, they've developed some muscle memory for it, so it will take some time for everyone in the league to get used to it, but after those growing pains are over, I think you'll have a much more pure version of the game where offensive players have to earn all of their points and defenders don't have to play with the fear of getting screwed over by some complete bullshit call. Proposal number 3, the defenses can be more physical again rule. Look, not all of these titles are winners. In general, I think the threshold for what is a foul in the NBA is a little weak. Obviously, the NBA has dialed back physicality for the sake of decreasing physical altercations in these games. But honestly, I think the culture of the modern NBA just wouldn't cultivate these types of interactions like they used to. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't want to go back to the WWE on hardwood era. Punching people mid-air is not defense, it's just admitting you can't play defense, so you hit them instead. But that doesn't mean that the changes we saw in the 2000s weren't an overcorrection. The difficult thing about fouls is they're kind of just vibes. Like, some stuff is obviously a foul, but a lot of the time things get left up to interpretation. The rules are actually designed to empower the officials to use discretion, and as a result, it's kind of hard to put this idea into concrete terms. It really is just more of a vibes thing, but nevertheless the idea is there. Not all contact needs to be called as it is now. A little bit of contact is good, and as long as you have a fairly consistent threshold for what's being called, well, I think you'll notice the results. Free throw rate is actually super low in the NBA right now, lower than it was for the more physical eras of the NBA, but that's really just a product of the general notion that you can't be physical at all, therefore defenders rarely attempt to do it. I'm actually okay with a few more fouls per game if it enables defenders to actually play defense when they're not fouling. Maybe this would actually increase scoring to a degree, but it would at least be scoring that felt more earned, not ticky-tack fouls or open shots because a defender is afraid of fouling. Proposal number 4, the Draymond Green rule. I know this seems like a setup for something funny like no more nut kicks or whatever, but the rule technically already exists. You're not supposed to nut kick. But what I am referring to is illegal screens. This is definitely something that's been exploited in the past few seasons. This is yet another rule that is more or less just saying actually enforce a rule that already exists. But regardless, it's something that would punish the offense for being sloppy, which I think is only fair given how much defenses are punished for being sloppy. Defending on perimeter jumpers is so much more pivotal to the game than it used to be. Getting open on down screens is a huge part of the game, so if the defense has to worry about all the running around that they do, I think it's only fair that they shouldn't also have to dodge the offense getting away with a violation consistently. Proposal number 5, the carry rule. For those who may not know, carrying is a violation an offensive player can commit while dribbling the ball, where they hold the ball with one hand for too long for it to continue to be a live dribble, but they continue the dribble anyways. Carrying is not called in the NBA almost at all, and to a degree I'm okay with this. I think enabling a little bit of carrying allows for more exciting dribble moves and ways of creating space, so for that reason I don't think carrying should be enforced strictly. However, there's a lot of shit that players get away with that is egregious, and it should be dialed back. So those are my suggestions. Like I said, they're pretty straightforward, but I honestly think that's for the better. Changing a few things to add more defense to the game really shouldn't be all that complex. There's a few things that should be fairly easy to implement here. It would just take some time for the players and refs to adjust the new officiating, but it would be worthwhile in the long run. Really, when you think about it, other than the 6-second rule, everything I just suggested is something that we regularly see in the NBA already. More physicality, not blowing the whistle on foul baiting, calling illegal screens and carrying more. That's all stuff that just happens in the playoffs. The playoffs this previous season were such a breath of fresh air for how I was feeling about offense in that season. Seeing the game with players more locked in on defense and allowed to get away with more physicality, it was just a way better viewing experience. Obviously, the environment of the playoffs plays a huge part in the intensity of it all, but at the bare minimum, the NBA can officiate more like it's the playoffs. But regardless of what changes should be made or should not be made, I do want to end on one note. I want to be clear that I love the NBA as it is now, and I can more than tolerate the current product. However, I feel like we're losing a part of the game that, fun or not, entertaining or not, is pivotal to the overall experience of the sport. Otherwise, it's becoming something else, something that, at least for me personally, is worse. Well, that's the end of the video. Thank you very much for watching. If you have managed to make it this far and you haven't already, please do me a huge favor and drop a like on this video, as it really helps the video do better in the algorithm. I know I said this last time and then actually just changed the topic, but that's not going to happen this time. The next video is just going to be me being a hater for like an hour. But yeah, that's it. Bye.